Welcome, everybody, to the third episode of the Jersey Blitz, NJ.com's high school football podcast. I'm Dan Long. I'm your host, joined alongside by my six NJ.com football beat writers, and we are going to be breaking down everything around the Garden State yet again this week. And we have a couple of big top 10 matchups in store for you that we're going to be diagnosing every part of those games in the North and in the South. We'll also have some chaos in the NJIC. We'll look at the Big Central Conference, and we'll have you all set there as we're getting ready for Week 4 action. But as we kick things off, I'm going to be bringing in a couple of guys here, Mike Kinney, Luis Torres, and Joe Sedalis, to talk about some of the big games from last week's action in New Jersey. And Luis Chatham with a big win against Mount Olive, a game that we broadcast a year ago and saw go the other way from Mount Olive. This year, it's the Cougars coming out on top.
Massive win. Chatham's always been kind of a solid program under fourth-year coach Evan Pecorello, and this is probably his biggest win so far of his tenure there at Chatham. And I mean, 7 tackles for loss, outgained. I mean, just completely took care of business and kind of capitalized on our opportunities. I mean, like you mentioned last year, we were there at that game last year when Mount Olive won, and Mount Olive ended up winning a sectional championship. I mean, this Chatham team, I think they opened a lot of people's eyes. I wasn't sure how many people actually gave them a shot heading into that game, but for them to come away with that win, I mean, maybe we should start thinking about Chatham as a potential contender there in Group 4. Great win. They actually outgained Montville the week before. Montville's off to a really good start as well. So things are looking up for the Cougars over there in Chatham and Morris County.
Mike Kinney, I saw Ridge firsthand when we were calling their game the previous week against Hillsborough. Then they really shocked everybody with showing that they have the staying power, upsetting Phillipsburg, who we were raving about as one of the top teams in the Big Central. Talk about that win by Ridge and back-to-back wins of big variety.
Impressive win, Dan. First of all, a great atmosphere up in Basking Ridge. Packed stadium up there. Phillipsburg travels well. Ridge's home crowd is fantastic. The student sections both stellar. Fun atmosphere Friday night. P-Bird came in as the favorite, but I'll tell you what, Ridge, with Aiden Stieglitz running the ball off that wing tee and countering a little bit with some of their other guys, just an absolute great preparation for Phillipsburg. Stieglitz was somebody who you just couldn't stop. His first run, first of all, there was a big stop. P-Birg ran down the field on their first possession of the game. Ridge stopped them inside the 5-yard line. Great stop. And then turned around and go 96 yards with Stieglitz running the ball. First carry, 13 yards. Second carry, 14 yards. You're thinking two things. I'm thinking two things. This kid came to play, but Phillipsburg is going to adjust at some point defensively. They're bound to do it. A few teams that I cover in the Big Central get to the football with many hats, as Phillipsburg does. They did adjust. And Stieglitz didn't care. Stieglitz just kept running through, off tackle, getting some space. And once he got space, if 2 or 3 guys confronted him, he bowled them over. Rushed for 220 yards and 3 touchdowns. Career highs for him. Huge upset for Ridge over Phillipsburg, which vaults Ridge into the top 20.
And Joe Sedalis saw a game-winning field goal down the shores. Freehold Township came away victorious in a nail-biter of a finish.
Yeah, it was something Freehold Township really needed. They're a little bit banged up, but the interesting thing about the game-winning field goal by James Russo as time expired was it took 3 tries. On the first attempt, he made it. Red Bank was called for offsides. Freehold Township accepts the penalty. On the second kick, Red Bank Regional blocks it, returns the ball for a touchdown, but the officials cite both teams for too many men on the field, offsetting penalties. They re-kick it again, and he makes the field goal this time. As a matter of fact, the NJSIAA today, Dan, admitted that there was a mistaken call. They should not have had the offsetting penalties there, but it was crazy. Freehold Township coach Corey Davies said, in his 25 years as a head coach, he's never seen anything like it. So the 2 teams come out on the field, they call a penalty, he gets another shot, makes it victory Freehold Township. They're 3-1.
So after looking at those exciting games from the last week, let's break down the Big Central Conference a little closer this time, and we'll bring back Mike Kinney here on the Jersey Blitz. And Mike, after that impressive win by Ridge, again, back-to-back victories for the Red Devils, How does that kind of throw a wrench into that triangle of teams that we have in our rankings from the Big Central? And who do you see now as the team to beat in that area?
At this point, Dan, I still think that St. Thomas is probably the team to beat in the Big Central. However, you talked about a wrench, a big wrench got thrown into my situation when Ridge beat Phillipsburg, because Peaburg was the #2 team in the Big Central, and our other ranked team along in the top 20, along with St. Thomas, and went in as the favorite against Ridge. And when Ridge pulled off that victory, fantastic game, 28-21, it seemed clear that Ridge would jump ahead of Phillipsburg in the top 20. However, the big thing was Ridge lost their first game of the season to St. Joe's Metuchen. It was a fantastic game down to the wire, 37-34 St. Joe's. But since then, St. Joe's hasn't done anything to diminish what they did against Ridge in that game. So sitting there trying to figure out the top 20, we had a tough triangle there. And we came down with the conclusion that St. Joe's should be ahead of Ridge, and then Ridge ahead of Phillipsburg. And that's the way it panned out in the Big Central team as far as the top 20 goes. So now we have St. Thomas as the top team. St. Joe's is the second team in the top 20. They've got Westfield this week. Ridge is #3, and then Phillipsburg at 4. I'm feeling pretty good about those 4 teams against almost anybody except maybe teams in their own division. Trouble in the Big Central.
Looking around the Big Central, Woodbridge claims a historic 500th victory in program history in a wild game against a school that they know a little something about.
Yeah. Fellow district, Woodbridge District School, Colonia. There's 3 schools in the Woodbridge District for anybody who may not know. It's Woodbridge High School, Colonia High School, and JFK, or as we refer to them, Island Kennedy. So they're all under the same umbrella of Woodbridge District. The 500th win was interesting. First of all, they're playing a sister school for it. And second of all, Island Kennedy opened in 1974, and Colonia opened a couple years later, 3 years later. So before that, Woodbridge began its football program in 1924. Before that, you had many years of winning football games. No doubt about it that there's players from Colonia, and if not on this team, certainly on the last several teams, and same thing with JFK, whose fathers, grandfathers, cousins, uncles played for Woodbridge High School, helped contribute to those 500 wins. So interesting that they got the 500th win with a team that they know quite a lot about. They play it for the bragging rights trophy, this game. It used to be a Thanksgiving Day game. Opened up, Woodbridge looked like they were going to roll. I'm thinking running clock second half. It's 21-0, 6 minutes into the game, Dan. Unbelievable. Woodbridge, Jameer Beal runs his first 2 carries, an 80-yard touchdown run and a 54-yard touchdown run. Jeremiah Allen, who right now is certainly playing as one of the top linebackers in the BCC, returns an interception for a touchdown. So it's 21-0. Colonia looks like they're flat. They're dead. There's no way they're coming back. Of course, the game's at Colonia. They're playing Woodbridge, their arch rival. There's no way they're not coming back. Ends up being a fantastic game. 3-point game early in the fourth quarter. Ends up a 3-point game, 32-29. Great atmosphere and terrific game. And the way Woodbridge should win that 500th game. It shouldn't have been a skate against their sister school. Should have been something they had to really sweat for. And it was wonderful. After the game, I'm talking to Brian Anderson, whose twin brother Derek is the quarterback. Brian's an outstanding receiver and defensive back. And I asked him what it meant to him, this game. He said, this game means everything to me, the Mayor's game. He said, this is one that goes back, our family has played in these games and talked about these games forever and ever. So it's so meaningful. You love to see that, excitement from a kid who's going to be playing college football about an old high school rivalry like that.
That's always cool to hear what that means in the grand scheme of things. I knew that I was at a game that we broadcast on Saturday where Bergen Catholic won their 500th career game. So it's the same good company there with Woodbridge after winning that 500th game in their history. Old Bridge now has moved to 2-2 after beating previously undefeated South Brunswick. Mike, what did you see with that matchup, and what is that showing now for Old Bridge taking that next step forward?
Old Bridge had a little bit of a dip in the program for a couple of years, and they're back the last couple of years now. Matt Donahue in his 3rd season doing an excellent job with them. Always tough kids. This goes back to Bob DeMarco coaching at Cedar Ridge when there were 2 high schools in Old Bridge, and just tough kids, competitors all the time. I see it in football. I see it in lacrosse. I even see it in basketball, where there's not an unbelievable amount of talent, but there's a great deal of zeal and competitiveness. So the football team is kind of on its way back to being so consistent. And they're very young too, which is really fun to see. Brody Nugent is a junior quarterback he did some good things as a sophomore last year, and I think he's really settled into being a real team leader now. He's got a sophomore receiver, Cam Oliveira. Jeremiah Dixon is a junior running back. There's so many sophomores and juniors on this team that the future looks great. But they almost beat Piscataway 2 weeks ago. Then they come back and they really handled South Brunswick, which was a surprise. But they did it with their running game. Did it with some spot passing from Nugent, and one trademark of Old Bridge when they're playing well is that they play really smart, tough defense, and they did against South Brunswick, holding them to 6 points. So Old Bridge right now is a team to deal with in their division, no doubt, and within the whole GMC, no doubt about it.
A team that Ridgewood certainly knows is tough to deal with is Piscataway. They're coming off a tough road loss at Ridgewood, but only by 1 point. And that was a Ridgewood team that really impressed the week before, handing it on the road to Ramapo. So does this mean that Piscataway is starting to claw their way back to the powerhouse program that we knew and loved for so many years? Is Piscataway building back up after not even having a program a couple of years ago, Mike?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And Ridgewood would know that because back in 2018, when Piscataway won the North Region 5 championship at MetLife, they beat Ridgewood to go 13-0 that season. Crazy. And sadly, 4 seasons later, they were 0-8 because the season before that, during COVID, they did not play. And you're right, that really set Piscataway back. Kids left and, understood. Kids left to go play elsewhere because they just wanted to play their senior years. They went to St. Joe's, they went to St. Thomas, they went other places to play, and completely reasonable for that. But coming back the next couple of years was very tough for Piscataway to get its numbers back, to get the kids excited again, to get the Pop Warner going again, and to keep the kids in the program. Dan Higgins has always been able to keep the best kids in Piscataway. They don't want to go anywhere else. So that's being seen now, and we're seeing this from this team. They had a very tough loss against Bridgewater, second game of the season, shootout, 52-48. Crazy game. Their defense needed lots of improvement, which they made over the next couple of weeks. And then to go to Ridgewood, a very good, tough Ridgewood team, runs that wing T, controls the football better than so many teams in North Jersey. So had a tough time getting the ball back and scoring. Thing about Piscataway is, and with Dan Higgins, is he's never worried about what happens the first 4, 5, 6 games, as long as there's progress being made. He doesn't care about the win or the loss. He worries about improving. And I'm seeing that improvement in Piscataway. The depth is there. For instance, in the backfield, Landon Purnell is a sophomore quarterback. He's coming a long, long way as a team leader. Coach Higgins put him in the lineup last year as a freshman. But beyond that, they have tremendous backfield ability. Jahai Johnson, Horace Thompson at fullback, James Bodley, Jamari Atkinson. There's lots of skill, lots of talent, lots of speed there. People are going to have to deal with that later in the year as Piscataway makes some improvements on its line and defensively. They're going to have to deal with those backs, and it's not going to be an easy thing to do.
Now shifting gears to maybe the most wild and open of all the football conferences in New Jersey, we're going to be taking a look at the NJIC and bringing in Ryan Patty and Luis Torres to talk everything about this crazy and chaotic conference. And that's what makes it so much fun, because with the results, even from the first couple of weeks of the season, it's tipped the scales completely. And Luis, one of those teams that's benefiting is Glen Rock in the early goings.
Yeah, especially they have the inside track now in the Liberty division. I think the Liberty division has been the most chaotic one of the 4 in the NJIC. It all started when Waldwick beat Rutherford in week 1, ending Rutherford's 23-game NJIC winning streak. And you would figure, all right, Waldwick probably has a chance to kind of compete for one of those 4 playoff spots. And then here comes Glen Rock. Glen Rock picks up a lopsided victory over Waldwick, kind of opening the door a little bit for Rutherford. And then Pompton Lakes beats Waldwick last weekend. So now you basically have a 2-horse race between Glen Rock and Rutherford. And they play this week. It's arguably the top game in the NJIC this weekend on Friday at 6 o'clock. Both those teams kind of control their own destinies. Like I mentioned, the door is open again for Rutherford, who has won the last 3 NJIC titles, to kind of get back in here. If they beat Glen Rock and win out these next 2 weeks, they're in the NJIC playoffs. And if Glen Rock takes care of business on Friday, they're going to win the division and go to the playoffs. So it's been chaotic and hectic in the Liberty division, especially. And it's what makes the NJIC so fun. You got the small schools going against each other.
Ryan, Patty, as much as we've been having chaos in one part of the NJIC, a team that has been the steadying force has been Butler, a team that believes that they have what it takes to bring home that NJIC championship this season. What do you know about Butler, and how can they then be one of those title contenders this fall?
Yeah, so Butler returns 8 starters from last year's team on offense and 9 starters on defense, and that was a team that reached the sectional finals, and they're actually number 4 in our Group 1 rankings. They lose Bobby Batapede from last year, quarterback Bobby Batapede, dual threat kid, really just strong, tough kid, not the biggest kid, but a rugged kid. They lose Kyle Perry, their running back, and then they lose Jason Murray, who was an absolute menace on both sides of the ball in the trenches. And he kind of dictated that game against Weequahic, the sectional semifinal game that Butler stunned Weequahic. And we thought Weequahic was a Group 1 contender, but Butler said not so fast. And they return, like I said, 8 starters on offense, 9 starters on defense. And one of the names that was expected to step up was PJ Coffey, and that's what he's done. 9 catches for 204 yards and 6 touchdowns. He also has 2 rushing touchdowns. And Mikey Henahan and Nick Parkinson are 2 other kids that are kind of making a difference there in that receiving core. But quarterback David Smith has been the one that's kind of taken this offense by storm. And you might recognize that last name, and that's because Evan Smith, his older brother, who graduated in 2020, led the team to a sectional championship in 2018 over Park Ridge. So there's championship DNA in the quarterback room there at Butler, and there's really no other name you'd rather have than Evan's brother, David. And this is also a team that's playing great defense. They had 2 40-point shutouts to start the season. Then they bottle up a very talented Secaucus offense to just 14 points. And you just have to see this team as the team to beat right now in the NJIC.
That's a great segue there. You're the professional in the business here, Ryan. So Ryan and then Luis, who are right now developing as your favorites to contend for that ultimate hardware at the end of the season for the NJIC, something that they get to play for compared to other conferences where you just played a league champions. You get the conference championship in the NJIC before embarking on the state tournament. Who are you looking at right now as we're developing this picture? Who's going to be the last 2 teams standing? Ryan, for you.
Well, I'm kind of glad that we waited until this week to talk about the NJIC. We didn't get the chance to talk about it last week. We wanted to let the dust settle a bit. And there's 2 divisions that are kind of still up for grabs. You got the Meadowlands division. Butler is, we think, going to get the chance to take on New Milford there in 2 weeks in what could be a division title matchup. And then, like Luis mentioned, Rutherford, Glen Rock, Pompton Lakes. I mean, there's a lot up for grabs there in the Liberty division, but it seems like St. Mary's going to hold on there in the Patriot after beating Park Ridge and then Woodridge. And then you have Beckton that took a stranglehold in week 0 by beating Lyndhurst, but has kind of handled business the next 3 weeks against their division opponents there. So there's a lot that could still happen, but there's a lot that does seem settled. But yeah, anything could happen in this league. It's a fascinating conference.
And Luis Torres, again, as we look at these things and we see that some big wins are really starting to weigh a little heavier, who are the teams that you feel are starting to make their way and get a little separation and will play for the NJIC championship in a couple weeks' time?
Yeah, like Ryan said, and we kind of touched on Butler. I think at the end of the day, I think heading into the season, you would figure that Butler was probably the favorite. Outside, we gave kind of the respect to maybe Rutherford, especially what they've done the last 3 years. But Butler seems poised this year to kind of take that step and become NJIC champions. But St. Mary, Rutherford, I mean, Coach Paul Johnson's done a really good job. They're really talented. They're huge on the offensive, defensive lines. They got a lot of size. They got a lot of speed. And Nasir Owens is one of the best running backs in Bergen County and in the NJIC. Brad Higgins, the quarterback, is playing really well. They've kind of gone through and kind of gone the quote unquote harder part of the schedule already kind of in the NJIC kind of already done with, and kind of beating Woodridge and Park Ridge to begin the season, of course, and also Weehawken. And so I think right now, if you ask me right now, I think if it shakes out, I think you see Butler playing St. Mary or Rutherford in the NJIC final. I think right now I'd probably lean towards Butler a little bit, kind of just on that continuity they've had. But St. Mary's is talented. They played DePaul in the state playoffs last year, and Coach Johnson told me before the year that kind of gave them a lot of confidence that, you know what, even though DePaul ended up winning that game by a handful of touchdowns, that, you know what, they can play with those guys and they have the talent to kind of do so. And I think they will definitely be there at the end of the NJIC championship.
So we've broken out the teams that have started to make headlines in the Big Central as well as the crazy NJIC. What about the teams that have surprised us so far this season? Maybe they've flown under the radar a bit, and we bring back Joe Zadalis to talk about Central Regional. They fit that description now, having a chance to play Southern. They're 4-0. Southern is also 4-0. Who's going to be that team that could emerge as they're now continuing to make a little noise this season? Again, Central and Southern, both teams that have been flying under the radar in the Shore.
Well, I think it's going to be a great game, first of all, Dan. Both teams have shown significant improvement over last year. I mean, Southern closed the season last year with 5 straight losses. They lost 6 of their last 7. In those 5 losses, they only scored 15 points. So when they went into their winter break, Chuck Donahue, has been a head football coach for over 50 years, challenged his team, challenged his coaching staff, had everybody take accountability for their part in the wheels falling off. So they've had a good offseason program. They've gotten things going. They're playing great defense, great special teams. They're not an offensive juggernaut by any stretch, but they're playing to their defense. They have a kicker who can flip the field. They have a kid who can make field goals. Then they've scored touchdowns on offense, defense, special teams. So I think it's going to be interesting. Southern is a little more run than pass. Central Regional is a little more pass than run. Now, Central Regional, on the other hand, Dan, they closed with winning 3 of their last 4. They have a player, and it's one of the great names in New Jersey, Royalty Riley. The kid has 14 catches for over 300 yards, and on defense, he's got a bunch of picks. That's been the key for Central, Dan. Central has forced 9 turnovers in its first 4 games. I do think it's going to be a close game. I think it's going to be played close to the vest. This game, as most are going to be won in the trenches. That's where Central Regional has made its biggest gains. Last year, they played a lot of young kids early on the offensive and defensive lines. Now those kids are experienced, and now they're playing great. I mean, Southern Regional on defense, Dan, they have 3 shutouts. That's as many as the last 2 years combined. Last week in a 42-0 win over Toms River East, that's the most points they've scored since 2020, and they're off to their best start since 2019. Should be a heck of a football game down in Manahawkin.
Now bringing in Bill Evans to talk about arguably maybe the team that is the most under the radar and the biggest Cinderella story to the start of this 2024 season, and that's Bridgeton, who is a perfect 4-0 under their new head coach after 2 winless seasons.
Yeah, Bridgeton, had been a pretty solid, consistent program for a number of years. Has a couple sectional titles on the resume, but it really kind of fallen on hard times, as you said, 0-17 the last 2 years. They bring in Dominique Williams, who is an alum of the school, kicked around the NFL and the CFL for a few years. Would come back, was an assistant for a while, and then was not on the staff the last few years, and was hired to kind of turn things around. And he's obviously really done that. First couple games, really kind of relied on their defense, only allowed 3 points. Then got into a shootout with Egg Harbor, which they were able to pull out 32-29, and then this past week fell behind 12-0 at Deptford, came back and won that game 20-12. Eric Hilton, the senior running back, has over 600 yards and 6 touchdowns. Had never played offense before. Just asked for the opportunity this year, and Coach Williams gave him that shot. They've been a really good story down in South Jersey, and they've got some competitive games coming up, but it definitely has the potential to keep going.
And Ryan, Patty, if there's a possible way of being undefeated, a state championship program from 2 years ago, usual contender for a sectional championship, and still being under the radar, that might be the resume right now for Oltapan. As Oltapan continues to win, they finally get that huge gorilla off their back in their last game, defeating Rampo for the first time in their last 5 matchups. What do you see from the Golden Knights of Oltapan, and why are they going to be considered as a team to watch now going forward?
Yeah, I mean we've talked about Passaic Tech, Union City, Ridgewood, and some of the other top teams up north, but Old Tappan, I'm glad to touch on because they've kind of passed all their tests to start the year. I mean, they started the year with a solid win against a West Essex team that I know our guy Mike Kinney's very high on, and then they pummeled a much improved Riverdale team before handling some business against Bergenfield and Ramapo. The Ramapo game was a little closer than I expected, but they did have some demons they had to overcome there because they hadn't beaten Ramapo the past couple years. They're using two quarterbacks in Alex Orecchio and sophomore Zach Maselli. Alex, threw the big pass to Evan Brooks there in that state title game 2 years ago after Tommy Caracciolo got injured. And he was the guy last year, a dual threat kid, a tough kid who can run, lower his shoulder, always falls forward when he runs the ball. And he was the hero, like I said, in that game against Delsey. And sophomore Zach Maselli comes in, and he's more of a pocket guy. They used Alex more so in that Ramapo game than they did Zach, but Zach's off to a very solid start to the year. He's got over 500 total yards rushing and passing, and he's got 9 total touchdowns, in the team's first 3 games. And we know how good Nick Rossi is in the backfield. I mean, there's a lot of guys who can do damage against you on this Old Tappan offense. And one of the big questions coming into the season that Coach Brian Dunn had, and he said it himself, was, I don't know how good, my offensive line is going to be because they lose Jack Small, who's now playing at Duke, and then Ryan O'Neal and Dennis Delaney, 2 very solid kids up front. And it was kind of like, all right, what do I have here up front? And they're passing all their tests. I mean, they look very good on both sides of the ball in the trenches, and they look good in all 3 phases and all positional units to start the year.
It was pretty interesting, Ryan, in being able to call that game. That was one of our games of the week last week at Rampo, that neither team had their usual stellar offense, that it was 3 and outs being traded back and forth throughout the course of the first quarter. But it was the inability of Rampo to score against Old Tappan when they were deep in Old Tappan territory. 3 times Rampo had it inside the Old Tappan 10-yard line to start off the game, and 3 times they came away with no points, and that allowed Orecchio and the offense to finally come around. And you felt that redemption, especially for that type of player who in the previous year, in that same game that we broadcast in Franklin Lakes, threw 5 interceptions. He came in as the hero, starting off as the wide receiver in a couple gadget plays, threw a couple touchdowns, ran it down Ramapo's throat in the second half, and they held on. While they were up by 2 scores, Ramapo made it closer at the end. It was still redemption for Orecchio and Old Tappan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just goes back to the championship DNA that this team has. I mean, Coach Brian Dunn is one of the the biggest winners up in North Jersey, top public school coach, and I think it really goes back to that moment against Delsey. Like Orecchio had done it before, and he did it multiple times last year. I know the year ended in sadness for them with that loss to West Morris that no one kind of expected, but it almost feels like they have a chip on their shoulder this year. They have something to prove, and they're a fringe top 20 team for us. We'll see what these next couple weeks hold. But I mean, we talked about Ramapo last week. It's another game for Ramapo where they come up empty and they lose a 1-possession game. They lost to Summers in week 1, and then they lost to Ridgewood in week 2. And it's 0-3. I can't even remember the last time Ramapo was 0-3. Luis and I were just talking about it. So it's there's some puzzling things to start the year, but one of the steadies the past couple of years has been Old Tappan after a couple down years in 2020 and 2021.
So we just looked at teams that maybe had been flying under the radar. Now we're going to have a look at some teams that have been right in the middle of the spotlight all season long. And this is a matchup that we were thinking about for a couple weeks now down in South Jersey as we bring in Kevin Minnick and Bill Evans. This is something that we were circling on our calendars. We were hyping it up and seeing, can these teams both be undefeated as they clash and they meet? And we got what we wanted. It's Winslow and Millville. Gentlemen, starting off with Kevin, what do we see on the horizon this matchup featuring the top teams in South Jersey going toe-to-toe in what we're hoping is going to be a great heavyweight fight?
Yeah, Dan, we circled this game at the beginning of the season. Everybody circled this game at the beginning of the season. You talk to both teams, they'll tell you, well, it's just another game. It's just the next game on the schedule. But, it's far more than that. This is a monstrous game in South Jersey football, and it's probably not won't be the last time these 2 teams will face each other. Both Group 4 teams, both heavily favored to go, as far as possible. But, to play in a state championship game, one of these teams is not going to get there. It's going to be tremendous athletes all over the field, as we've talked about in the past with these two teams. They're both coming off really big wins over strong opponents. Millville knocking off Washington Township, and Winslow, knocking off a St. Augustine team that was probably the toughest opponent they faced this year. So it has everything you could. If you're making a cake and you want it to be the best cake you can make, you put the best quality ingredients in it that you can. That's what this football game is going to be like. There are quality ingredients on both sides of the team, both sides of the ball, both sides of the field, that is going to make for a fabulous matchup.
Bill Evans, this is the star-studded matchup we were hoping for. Again, that everyone's healthy, everyone's good to go. It's undefeated football. It's bragging rights, and as Kevin alluded to, it could be just the appetizer for a main course down the line in the postseason. What is your read on this matchup, and who do you think it kind of favors right now going into this weekend?
Well, I think that the teams are pretty evenly matched. I mean, they both have an all-state receiver, Latsier Brooks for Millville, Winslow, Cam Miller, complimentary running game for both of them, sophomore quarterbacks, very good defenses. So I think, it's going to come down to, whoever can play to their strengths the best. Millville's probably, it's hard to say. Millville's probably been a little more battle tested in terms of, they're 4-0 and they've beaten four really good teams pretty handily. Winslow might have played the best team out of any of the opponents for either side, in St. Augustine last week. And, I think this is going to be a great matchup. I kind of go back a few years ago. Lenape and Williamstown were the two big teams in Group 5. Another year Lenape and RV. And, we saw them in the regular season. It was a great game. We saw them in the playoffs in a great game. And I think, as Kevin said, this is probably, going to be the same way. I think, we'll see them now, and we're going to see them sometime in November. If I have to pick somebody right now, Millville's just been clicking on all cylinders. Again, they've beaten some really, really good teams, and they're the team we've had at the top from the very beginning. But Winslow has a chance here to knock them off. But this is number 1 and number 2 in South Jersey.
And Kevin, if you had to pick a winner here and get that crystal ball out, who are you feeling is going to emerge with the still unblemished 5-0 record?
Dan, you can't put me on the spot like that. I literally have written down coin flip, and to me, it can be a coin flip game. Winslow has, like Bill said, Winslow's got some players, and they just got back a transfer in Marcus Upton, who, if this game has a quote unquote X factor, could be Marcus Upton. Transfer from Timber Creek, had an outstanding game on both sides of the ball last week for Winslow. You look at the Millville side, and we've talked about it, and we'll continue to talk about it. Latsier Brooks, this is a big game. And as Latsier says, big players show up in big games. So you can expect Latsier Brooks to come up, and he's going to get his at some point. It's a matter of how much. So while I think it's a coin flip, Millville, like Bill says, Millville has played the tougher opponents to this point in the season, and they're playing at home. They love the turf at home. It's going to be a wild atmosphere. So while in my mind, in my heart, I want to say coin flip, push comes to shove, I would probably lean towards Millville. But, this game could be 35-28. It could be 16-14. I mean, it's just a matter of which team really kind of gets it going. And, maybe both teams do, and we end up with a real barn burner. So, but regardless, it's going to be a dynamic football game.
So after talking about a titanic matchup down in South Jersey, we shift all the way up north, and this is the rivalry that everyone talks about year in and year out. It's Bergen Catholic versus Don Bosco Prep, or if you're a Don Bosco fan, it's Don Bosco Bergen Catholic, and you put them first before the Crusaders. And back to talk about this epic showdown in Bergen County is Ryan Patty and Luis Torres. And the first question that I have for you, Luis, is can Bosco do what they did back in 2022, come to Crusader Stadium and Jack McGovern Field and be rude guests and spoil the first home game of the season for Bergen Catholic? The last couple of times, Bosco has come away with a win when they've come to Oradell.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you have two rivals like this, you kind of throw out the record books out the window. I was there in 2022, and that was my first foray into the rivalry, and it was awesome. I don't think Bergen's gonna be wearing those black uniforms ever again after coming out pregame and their normal uniforms are coming out and wearing black that day. It just kind of didn't work out well for them, but that was my first foray into the rivalry. One thing that's kind of been working for Bosco, they were off last week, so they got a chance to kind of heal up a little bit after their first 3 games. Offensively, I think they've scored on 12 of their last 13 possessions with the ones. We were there at the Bergen Catholic game. I think they scored on all 6 possessions with the ones out there. And then they went and played at St. Anthony's and beat St. Anthony's out of New York 49-10. And with the ones kind of doing their thing, I think they had one drive where they punted. So the offense has been humming lately. Devin Sisser's not turning the ball over, hasn't turned the ball over the last 2 games. And the offensive line has kind of gotten going with Matt Maetti and Rhett Morris. And they're going to need more of that. They're going to have to move the ball against a stout Bergen Catholic defense if Don Bosco wants to go up there and shock Bergen Catholic like they did 2 years ago.
And that happens to be the last time that Bergen Catholic lost to a New Jersey opponent was when they lost at home against Don Bosco in 2022. And Ryan Patty, Bergen Catholic certainly is known for their championship level defense. Some of the questions in that IMG loss in the beginning of the season was, do they have enough on offense to get their way through the host of ranked teams in the nation? Well, they've developed that offense over the last couple of weeks against Massillon, getting the win at Iona Prep, and then they absolutely exploded in a game that I broadcast this past weekend at Pope John, where they scored touchdowns on every single drive that they had on offense, including when they took their starters out of the game by the second quarter. Can this Bergen Catholic offense present some serious matchup problems with Don Bosco Prep on Saturday?
Yeah, Luis mentioned the 12 of 13 possessions where Don Bosco scored, and that's a fascinating matchup for Bergen Catholic's defense. But I think the efficiency of Bergen Catholic's offense is even more fascinating when you look at the guys who can do damage against you. And Dan, you saw it firsthand. They had so many different kids touch the ball against Pope John, and they can beat you in a number of ways. And I think you have to look right away at that backfield in Najee Calhoun and Dante Kane. There are 2 running backs that have similar skill sets, but they're also versatile. I mean, Calhoun is more of a speedster who can, get to the edge and beat defenders once he gets in space in the second and third levels, but he could also run between the tackles. And Dante Kane is more of a between the tackles guy, but they could dump it off to him. They could, run tosses and stretches where he gets, outside, and he can really make defenses pay. But, the receiving core, obviously it starts with Quincy Porter, can beat you underneath. You run a bubble to him and he'll take it 80 yards. You could throw it deep downfield to him, and he can beat everyone over the top. Anthony Parati, Quincy's brother Brian, John Morris at tight end. I mean, there's so many guys who can hurt you. And the quarterback play of Dominic Campanelli has only gotten better, and he's a very, very intelligent quarterback. And I think what's fascinating is that in games like these, Bergen doesn't really, roll the dice too much. They're not going to throw downfield a whole lot. They have guys who can, beat you downfield, and Quincy and Brian and Anthony Parati with his speed. But it's games like this where they really value the football, and they're just going to beat you, between the tackles here. And I think that's what's going to happen. And Vito, no one knows better than Vito on valuing the football and how important that is in a game like this, because kind of costed them in that 2022 regular season game.
The combination of turnovers and deadly efficiency saw at one point in their game against Pope John this past weekend, Bergen Catholic scored 4 touchdowns and 5 total plays. That was just remarkable to watch and just take it to another level against their first New Jersey opponent this season. Luis, does Don Bosco Prep have the bodies up front to control the line of scrimmage and to shut down what Ryan was just talking about, that 2-headed monster at running back for BC? You got to have the big guys up front, force a little pressure on Dominic Campanelli. Does Bosco have that?
I think they do. Of course, they graduated a ton on that defensive line last year, and Lamont Lesser's at Monmouth and Jordan Thomas who's at Georgia. But I think that was kind of the question mark defensively, kind of heading into the years. How was their defensive line kind of going to have to have new kids kind of step up and kind of take that next step? And Robert Eakins has kind of been one of those guys who's a junior who got a lot of playing time last year as a sophomore. But the strength of Bosco's defense comes from their linebackers and their secondary. I think they're going to get a huge boost kind of in the secondary when Rennick Dorlis, who's going to be eligible and playing his first game. He's a transfer from Union High School. He's a Rutgers commit, a 3-star kid who I think is going to they're going to get the ball in his hands on offense and on defense. But to kind of help the defensive line, I expect linebackers Kyle Ramos, who's going to Navy, who's been a productive player his entire career at Bosco, and junior Matt Octopinti, who looks the part. He's about 6'2", 220, physical linebacker. He's kind of the next guy who I know Coach Dan Sabella he thinks he's a power 4 type of talent. He's kind of gotten some visits. So there, those guys, and then you have Mekhi Allen in the backfield, who's kind of almost like another linebacker, who's a huge safety, 6'2", very well put together. But I think those guys are going to be able to help the defensive front and the defensive line to kind of try to get pressure against the Dom Campanelli, because they're going to have to create and simulate pressures to try to force turnovers. And they're like Ryan mentioned, Bergen's been so efficient on offense as well. And they're explosive all over the field. They have players all over the field. So Bosco's got his work cut out for them on Saturday there at Crusader Stadium.
And Ryan, Luis mentioned how there's going to be a boost in the lineup for Don Bosco Prep. Well, the rich get richer if it's Bergen Catholic. You want to talk about a boost. How about having Jack Harris, who was a standout player at Rumson Fairhaven a season ago? He's now going to come into the Bergen Catholic lineup after sitting out the first 4 games for the Crusaders, and he's going to provide a huge lift for both the offensive and defensive lines.
Yeah, Bergen got Phoenix DeCosmo back last week from the Pacific Northwest. He transferred in and played, his first game with Bergen, where his brother played many incredible games along the defensive line for the Crusaders. But Jack Harris is going to play his first game at the Jack this week. And he was at Hunt as a freshman, Rumson as a sophomore, and now he'll be playing on both sides of the line for Bergen after sitting the first 30 days of the season as he was required to do. But he played on the D-line at Rumson, and he was a menace in that Group 2 title game against Westwood. He blew up so many plays, and he's going to play, I think, a little more O-line on Saturday than D-line, but he'll play a little bit of D-line, and he'll wreak havoc as he always does. But I think this is a great move for Bergen, playing him on the offensive line, because they have so much. They can go 2 deep just about across the D-line. And when you get a kid with Harris's athleticism and you put him at guard where he can pull and he can just move guys downfield, he's got the chance to be an absolute freak on the O-line. And, Bergen's had some studs on the offensive line. They already have one in Chris Vigna, who's going to Rutgers. And I think that Jack Harris has the chance to be right in line and become another power 4 kid on the offensive line for Bergen.
What about that? Making your debut in front of a jam-packed crowd at Crusader Stadium as part of Bergen versus Bosco. It doesn't get any better if you're Harris or anyone else debuting in this game. So, gentlemen, your final thoughts, your prediction of who wins this epic chapter of Bergen Catholic versus Don Bosco Prep. Ryan, who do you think comes away with a victory on Saturday in Ordell?
I think the pick has to be Bergen here. And I've said it before, on our podcast, anything can happen in this league, but I think you have to be hard-pressed to pick against Bergen when, like you said, the last time they lost was to Bosco, in state that is, to Bosco in 2022. That's an 18-game winning streak against New Jersey teams. And in these types of games, they just line up, like I said, and just beat you between the tackles, and they wear you down. They're not going to play for a shootout like they did against Massillon and IMG and against these other, national teams they play. They line up in games like this, and they just run the ball down your throat, and they beat you. I just got off the phone with Vito a couple hours ago, and I asked him what's gotten better since that game against IMG, and I knew he was going to do this because he always does it, but he didn't get into X's and O's. He just got right into family and, playing for one another. And that's what this program's built on. It's the culture that he's built since he got here a couple of years ago from Seton Hall Prep. And it's about playing for the guy next to you at Bergen. And, these kids would lose fingernails and toenails for each other. And that's what wins in this league where everyone's got power 4 kids. It's about, clawing and scratching for these wins. And the saying goes, it's a game of inches, but that's exactly what this game is.
Luis, this is the game that for both of those school communities is the one that matters the most. It's what you circle on the calendar before the start of a season. It's what the alumni boast about at work on Monday. Who, in your mind, takes home the victory on Saturday at Crusader Stadium?
I think Ryan put it perfectly. I think my pick is also Bergen. I mean, the run they've been on over the last couple of years has been pretty remarkable. I mean, not a lot of teams have given them a game or can match up just across the board. I mean, Ryan's mentioning, I mean, they could just go too deep kind of almost everywhere. I mean, they have so much depth, so much talent. I mean, there is a pathway for Bosco to kind of do what they did in 2022, which is control the ball, control the clock, get a couple special teams plays. I know they forced a fumble and recovered a fumble and got a short territory, a short field to kind of score and take a 2 or 3 touchdown lead back in 2022. But I just think Bergen has too much talent across the board, and they're just so deep, and they could just do whatever they want. The backfield has been remarkable. Najee Calhoun had 43 carries a couple weeks ago against Massillon when I think Dante Kane was out with a injury and he came back the next week. I mean, Bergen is just loaded, and I think they're going to come away with another win.
Well, thanks, guys. That's going to be one of our broadcasts to enjoy this week here on NJ.com. We'll get you started on Friday night down the shore as we'll be taking a look at Jack Harris's old team, Rumson Fairhaven. They're going to be trying to keep it going as they're going to be taking on Perennial Power in Middletown South. That game is going to be on Friday at 7 p.m. You can watch that game live or on demand, NJ.com/watch. And then we will be getting to Crusader Stadium and Jack McGovern Field, and we might have to do that now with a parking situation and make sure that we have a spot ready for us, as it's going to be Bergen Catholic versus Don Bosco Prep in our Saturday game of the week. You'll be able to watch that game live and also on demand. Kickoff is going to be at 1 p.m. on Saturday. So that's going to be another great slate of broadcasts here on NJ.com. And that's been another great edition here of the Jersey Blitz, NJ.com's high school football podcast. Another episode in the books here today. I'd like to thank my partners, Luis Torres, Ryan Patty, Mike Kinney, Kevin Minnick, Bill Evans, Joe Zadalis, and our engineer, Brian Decon, for his help. We'll join you next week when you're in the huddle here, the Jersey Blitz, NJ.com's high school football podcast. I'm Dan Long. Seeing you next week.